Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's December and you know what that means. Let's go and wrap up November. I had a really good reading month in November. I'm really pleased with what I got through, especially because November was a readathon month for me. I was one of the co-captains of Team Huntsman in Once Upon a Readathon and I had a really good time with it. It was good fun and a lot of people really enjoyed it, so I'm very happy about that. I'll do the usual format here, so stats first and then books after. If you want to just skip the stats and go straight to the books, use the timestamps down below and you can go straight onto it. But in terms of that boring stuff that I find quite interesting, I read 10 books, 2 of them were novellas, and it gave me a total page count for November of 3,862, with an average of 455. Year to date, that's 32,488 pages now, with an average page count of 505. And as usual, both of those averages exclude the novellas because they would really skew the data. In terms of the average rating, in November I ended up with 3.85, which means the year to date has dropped ever so slightly and is now at 3.92. Onto the series, and I've now started 21 different series in 2022, so I'm going to see if I can nudge that up one in December and have 22 for 2022. I've now finished 6 because I did have one series come to an end in November. I'm up to date with 12 series and I now have a total of 30 series that are currently ongoing. Days since the last 5-star read, I did have two in fact in November, so I'm currently at 16 days since that last 5-star. Alrighty, so onto the books, and I'm not going to go through all of the prompts for the readathon that I read each individual book for because that would take a bit too time and I haven't actually written it down, so I'll be going from memory on it. But I started off with a nice short book which I did on audio. This was The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. Now, years ago I saw the animated movie of this and it was a really nice movie. I've got a copy of it to watch with my young daughter as well, and I did quite enjoy it. The audiobook or the novel itself was very, very similar. So I know Peter S. Beagle, the author, did write the screenplay for the animation, and that really shows because it is a very, very faithful adaptation. So I'm really pleased with that. It did mean that it was kind of like a reread for me because I knew a lot of what was going to be happening. I knew all of the characters. I knew a fair amount of the dialogue even. So it was kind of strange in that respect because it was a first time read, but it was still an enjoyable experience for me. It's a really nice kind of poignant tale. It's very well narrated on the audio that I listened to. So that definitely helped this one go by quite quickly for me. So for those who don't know, this is the story of essentially The Last Unicorn. That's pretty obvious, I would guess, because that's the title of the book. And you've got this unicorn who is basically in her forest and she's not seen one of her kind. And she hears rumours that the other unicorns have gone somewhere and she goes out to seek them. And obviously I'm not going to go into details of where that takes her and what happens because I don't do spoilers in my wrap up, but she goes on a journey and she meets various people and there's a lot of things happen that are in many ways quite sad, but it makes for a really nice tale. It is one that is aimed, I would say, at the younger audience. It's not overly complex. There's some definite themes in there to look out for, but it's absolutely suitable for a younger person. For me as an adult, I still enjoyed it. I would definitely say that my enjoyment was slightly increased by the kind of nostalgia value, I guess, but I ended up giving this one 4 stars to give me a good solid start to the month. Next up, and this one was for a specific prompt, I read the novella Once Upon a Time in the North by Philip Pullman. This is a companion novella to the His Dark Material series that starts in the UK with Northern Lights, or in the US it's The Golden Compass, and this is a story of how 2 of the characters first met each other and became friends basically. So you've got Yorick, the giant armoured bear, and you've got Lee Scoresby, who is the aeronaut, the airship pilot. Now, I read the trilogy that makes up His Dark Materials a long time ago and I quite enjoyed them. They weren't great, but I did have a decent enough time with them. And this one I didn't really get too much out of, I have to say. If I'd have read it back at the time when it came out and when I was reading those books, I reckon I probably would have had a better time with it. But for me, this just didn't do anything. I think I moved too far past it and it just didn't have any real meaning for me. I didn't get anything much out of it, so that was definitely disappointing. The book itself, I mean, this little volume. It's cloth bound and there's illustrations in it, and there's chapter header kind of pictures and things like that. So some nice little artwork in there, and there's a nice map at the back as well, and it's a game that you've got there with various bits and pieces, a little wind compass so you can play this game. So it's a really nice kind of keepsake, I guess, a really nice little volume. It looks quite pretty just to have that. But as far as the story goes, yeah, it didn't really work for me. It was well written, it's just I've moved past it basically, so I wasn't really very interested in it. I have to say, if I wasn't reading it for the readathon with the once upon a or time in the title, of which this of course has all of those, so scored me the bonus points for that particular prompt, I reckon I would have DNF'd this one, or admittedly I wouldn't have started it in the first place. So it wasn't the greatest of times, but it was still a very well written story, even if it wasn't for me. I ended up giving this one 3 stars. Next up, I moved to an SPFB08 finalist. I listened to the audio for The 13th Hour, which is book 1 in the Cruel God series by Trudy Skies. This is one that I would have been reading anyway, because I'm now going to be reading all of the SPFB08's finalists, but this one I actually read because I've had a number of people recommending it to me. It's not really my normal kind of thing, but I was told that I might still get a good amount of enjoyment out of it, and I was genuinely intrigued by it. So I picked this one up, and I have to say I didn't really enjoy the audio of it. I think I might have enjoyed it more if I'd have read it rather than listening to it. So there were various factors in the audio that just didn't land for me. I won't go into it in too much detail here because I'll link in the top corner instead my dedicated review that I did for this a week or two ago. Overall, it was a good story. It was really impressive world building. I was genuinely interested in all of that side of things. It's just there was those couple of niggles in the audio that didn't work for me, and I think, as I say, kind of spoilt my enjoyment overall. This was another 3-star read for me, which was a little bit disappointing, but also you've got to kind of temper that, I guess, with the knowledge that this isn't really my normal type of fantasy that I read. It's a sort of steampunk setting, it's listed as gaslamp fantasy, so it was definitely out of my comfort zone, but I was still happy to have given it a try, and I definitely recommend checking it out if you like that kind of thing. Sometimes when you go out of your comfort zone, it does work for you, and that's what I got with my next read, which was Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. So this one I don't think I need to talk too much about because so many people have already read this or at least know about it, and again it's one that I did a dedicated review for that I'll link in that top corner there. I really enjoyed this one as something just completely different, just a bit of light reading, which is exactly what it's for. It's well known as being a cosy fantasy. There's not very much in terms of the high stakes in here, and it's just a really good, enjoyable read. I love the writing in this, I loved the overall idea, the characters were really nice, it was a quirky little read with some really good themes in it as well. So this was one of my 5-star reads of the month. A very definite surprise, but at the same time I've heard so much good about it, and it is my kind of setting. It's in an epic fantasy world. It's just showing the everyday side of it rather than the big epic quests and the big battles and things like that. So maybe it wasn't actually too much of a surprise, but a 5-star read that I definitely recommend. Then there's another audiobook that I listened to in November. This was the Written by Bengali book 1 of Emaneska. So with this one, it's now available, this series, for the first time in audio, and the first book for certain countries at least. I'm not sure on the localization of it, but for the UK at least, where I am, book 1 is available for free as part of your Audible membership. So I was looking to pick this series up anyway. It's been on my list for a fairly long time, and having it available for free just gave me that extra little push to pick it up, and I'm really glad I did. Now, as far as the story itself goes, it's definitely my sort of thing. It's an epic fantasy. It's got lots of the epic kind of tropes and creatures and things like that in it, and I really enjoyed it. It was really well written. I liked the ideas in it. I liked the plot. I liked the characters. I liked pretty much everything about this. There were a few little things that were maybe a little bit predictable, but nothing too much, and you'll always have an element of that. What I really enjoyed here though was the audio. It was a fantastic narration that just really worked for me. It's a Scottish narrator, Stephen Cree, who's been in things such as Outlander, and for me, his voice is just perfect for this kind of epic fantasy. It's definitely the type of narration that really suits this story, and that obviously improved my enjoyment of it because everything just kind of fell into line. This is another one that I've done a dedicated review for, so go and check that one out if you want to hear more, but it was a 5-star read for me. My next audio after the written was Aching God by Mike Shell. This was a patron pick. I put up a poll of a few titles and this is one that was picked out. It wasn't really surprising because I know a few of my patrons really like this and have been looking for me to read it in the past as well. It was on my list for the year, so it was one that I was definitely going to be picking in either November or December anyway, so thumbs up there. I didn't have quite as good a time with this as many of my patrons perhaps expected me to. It was a good story, I liked the overall idea, but it just didn't work for me. I felt it was a little bit too slow, there was a bit too much travel, and that really kind of took me out of the story. I felt that we had a quest and we took so long getting there. We had a few little things like little sub-quests and so forth that happened along the way, but it was mostly travel, and then when we got pretty much to the starting location of the quest, I was just sitting there listening to the characters as they were sitting in themselves on council deliberations, and it completely lost me at that point. I guess I wasn't interested at all. I just wanted the story to ramp up because we were getting toward the end of the book, and that's when things normally start kicking off. So things did obviously start happening after that, but it had kind of lost me, as I say, by that point. I wasn't really enthused by it. I was already deciding that I just wanted to get the book finished so I can move on to something that would grip me from the start a bit better and continue my enjoyment throughout. So it was a disappointing read because I was really hoping to have a good time with this, obviously, because that's what happens whenever I pick up a book. Lots of people love this one, but it just didn't work for me. I definitely still recommend picking it up if it sounds good to you, because hopefully you'll have a better experience than I did. Now this is another one that where I listened to it, I think maybe the narration kind of played into that for me, because I think the tone of the narration didn't really work for me in some of those slower periods. It was a bit of a kind of drone for me when we were going through those slowly paced bits, so that I definitely have to take into consideration. And I think this is another one that I might have enjoyed a little bit more if I was reading it rather than listening to it. We'll never know though, because I did listen to it and not read it physically, but overall I ended up giving this one 3 stars. My next read in November was Beckoning of the Gate by Benjamin J. Ryan, which I've said this plenty of times before, but I love that cover. It's just really cool. I love the colours on it and it's really atmospheric. I can now confirm to a couple of my viewers who have asked the question, no, it is not a fox. The animal companion you see there is just a dog described as having a particularly bushy tail. So maybe that's a bit disappointing. I don't know. It's still a pretty cool animal companion though, I guess. This one was kindly sent to me by the author and it arrived just in time for me to read it for the readathon in November, so happy days there. It was another one that was on my reading plan. I've been looking forward to reading it for a while, drawn by that cover. And I'm glad I did, because I had a pretty good time with this. It's a well-written story. There's lots of weird things in this one, largely falling under the banner of whites. There are various different types of white and there's various rules around them. So there's some really good world building that goes into this one. The characters were decent. They weren't the best that I read this month, but I still got on with them absolutely fine. And the overall story, I thought, was pretty good. Now this one is book 1 in a series, but it felt like it was pretty well wrapped up within this volume, so I'm not sure when or what we're going to get for book 2 or any other books in this series, but I'll be interested in checking out when there's more information available. So this is one of the books that I definitely had a good time with this month, and I gave it 4 stars. Then my last audiobook that I chose for November was by Rob J. Hayes. I read book 3 of The War Eternal, which is From Cold Ashes Risen. Now, I knew from the start that I was likely to really enjoy this one, partly because the story from what I've read in the first 2 books was very enjoyable. I love the character, I love the writing in it, I love the language in it as well. It really suits the character, so I'm really pleased with that. But I know also that this is a narration in the audio that is absolutely perfect for me, for the character that is telling this story in the first person. So this is a narration by Moira Quirk, and if you do get the opportunity to listen to this one, I highly recommend it, because it is another one that is absolutely fantastic. Like with The Written as book one of Emaneska, the first book in this series, Along the Razor's Edge, is, or at least was, available for free for Audible members, which is why I picked this one up in the first place, and I'm really glad I did, because I'm having such a great time in The War Eternal. I kind of feel a little bit strange talking about this one, because obviously the further you go into a series, the more you, I guess, kind of alienate some people when you're talking about the books, because it's only really applicable information for those who have read the books that come before, and in this case there's now 2 books that various people, of course, won't have read. I did find that there's not kind of too much to say about it anyway, because I've already spoken about book 1 at length. I did a dedicated review for it because I had a great time with that. It's one of my favourites of the year. Book 2 wasn't quite as good. Book 3, again, wasn't quite as good as book 1, but I think I did prefer it a little bit to the second book in the series. Overall, there's not too much new though. There's obviously some new characters and some new locations and some new themes that get introduced. So where I say there's not too much to say about it, it's because I've already said those things for the first 2 books. It's very much continuing in the same vein, which is a very good thing to do, because the bar had been set pretty darn high to start with. So this one I gave 4 stars to. I'm looking forward to continuing and finishing the series as one of my 2023 reading goals. Now, while I lament for editing Dom and wonder if I rambled enough in that particular mini review, I'll move on to the last novel that I read in November, which was The Fury of Fate by D.W. Ross. This was the series that I finished this month as book 3 in the Onyxborn Chronicle. So once more, I won't say too much about the story or anything along those lines in this one, because it is a 3rd book in the series, but I really enjoyed Cold from the North, and the 2nd book in the series, The Darkest Dusk, wasn't quite as good for me, but was still a very good read. This one for me definitely improved on book 2, and I often find that with the 3rd book in the series, or certainly with a final book in a series, because everything really gets pulled together, and you've got often the big climax of the series, big battles or big reveals and so forth, and you had that in spades here. I really enjoyed the battle that you got to kind of close off the story and to tie off a lot of loose ends. There were some things that were a bit too predictable, but as I said earlier on with The Written, I think it was, it's not a bad thing if it's written well, and in this case I felt that it was written well. So it's definitely a good read and a very fitting way to finish off what has been a good series for me. I gave The Fury of Fate 4 stars. And then my final book for November was a novella just to round out the month. I read Portrait of a King, which is listed as Heritor's Helm book 0.5, so that means it's the kind of prequel novella essentially to the first book in the series, which is Fire of the Forebears. Now, I really loved Fire of the Forebears by L.A. Book, and I was really saddened to hear that the author had passed away after writing it, so we won't get any more in the series. But it was very much a book that stands well on its own. It's not one that left lots of open threads that need tying off or anything along those lines, so I definitely still recommend trying it out if you're interested in the synopsis, even knowing that there won't be a 2nd or a 3rd book in the series, because I personally don't think that you need that 2nd or 3rd book. It's pretty much a standalone in my eyes. The novella though is set, I think it's 23 years before events of Fire of the Forebears, so it tells you obviously some of the backstory that you hear about and introduces some of the characters that you read about in Fire of the Forebears itself. I did quite enjoy this one, although obviously not having some of the main characters that I really felt attached to from Fire of the Forebears, it wasn't quite the same. It felt almost like I was reading a very different story with just a couple of characters who I recognised, rather than actually a story that leads into Fire of the Forebears or anything along those lines. So it's kind of a bit of a weird experience in that sense. It's definitely one that you don't have to read then in order to read the book. It just expands on a little bit of the history of the world ready for when you do read it. So with this one, there's not a vast amount of world building, because most of that is done in the book, and I always find with novellas that there are 3 main areas and you tend to sacrifice one because there's obviously a limited page count and you can't do justice to all of them. So you've got the plot, the characters, and the world building. And I think with this one, it was definitely focused on the characters, and obviously there's a plot that goes along with those, but you don't have quite as much world building because it does have that kind of narrow focus. It was still a very enjoyable read. It expanded my overall knowledge of the world and the events of this particular series, so I'm glad that I picked it up. And I gave it 3.5 stars because it was a good read that I really enjoyed as a nice way to wrap up my month. So there we go, 10 books or 8 books and 2 novellas if you want to look at it in that particular breakdown. I really enjoyed the reading month that I had overall. I had some really good books in there with 2 scoring 5 stars and several scoring 4 stars. So it's a month that I'm really pleased with. Let me know in the comments down below how your month went. Did you get as much read as you wanted to? Did you have some really good titles amongst the books that you read? If you did Once Upon a Readathon as well, let me know how you got on with that. Hopefully you had a good time as I did and as many of my fellow huntsmen did as well. In the description box below this video, as usual, you can find all of my social media and support the channel links, including my book club Discord. If you want to join in with some like-minded people talking about fantasy primarily, but other books as well, do come along and join in the fun. That's it for today. I hope to see you in the next video sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.